All right, so on April 1st, 2026, President Trump gave a major address to the nation. It was 1 month into this significant military conflict with Iran, codenamed Operation Epic Fury. So what we're going to do is break down the key claims and justifications he laid out in that speech.
Right out of the gate, he opened with this incredibly bold statement. He framed the whole operation as a military victory on a historic scale. I mean, that line right there really set the tone for everything else he was about to say.
So to unpack all of this, we're going to look at 5 key themes from the address. We'll start with his declaration of a decisive victory, then get into the mission's rationale. After that, we'll touch on the impact on energy, the human cost of the conflict, and finish up with what he called an unintended regime change.
Okay, so first up, that central claim of just overwhelming success on the battlefield. The president's assessment of the first month was, well, it was absolutely clear-cut.
The timing of the address was no accident. It marked exactly 1 month, 32 days, since Operation Epic Fury had launched. So the whole speech was really presented as a kind of status update on just how much had been accomplished in that very short amount of time. And when you look at the specifics, the sheer scope of the achievements he claimed is pretty staggering. According to the address, in just 4 weeks, Iran's navy was, quote, gone. Its air force was in ruins. He said most of their key leaders were dead, the Revolutionary Guard Corps was decimated, and Iran's ability to build or even launch missiles and drones was basically eliminated.
So you have to ask, why? Why was this action taken in the first place? Let's move on and look at how the mission's rationale was actually explained in the speech.
And this was the core of it. This was the single primary objective that he kept coming back to. The entire operation was framed as something that had to be done to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, which he described as an intolerable threat.
The speech didn't present this operation in a vacuum. It was placed on a timeline of actions that his administration had taken over the years. It starts with pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal back in 2018, then the killing of General Soleimani in 2020, and then more recently he cited a strike in June 2025 on nuclear sites called Operation Midnight Hammer as a lead-up to this much larger conflict.
And this is where he really drew a line in the sand. He made a sharp contrast with the past. He specifically called out the previous administration's approach, referencing that $1.7 billion cash payment, and framed his own actions as the tough, necessary decision that other leaders just weren't willing to make.
Of course, any conflict in the Middle East immediately makes people think about the economy, especially gas prices. So the address made a point to tackle the issue of energy head-on.
This was the big question for a lot of Americans at the time. Gas prices were definitely spiking, and people wanted to know why. The president actually spent a good chunk of his speech answering this exact question.
And the explanation he gave was this. The price hikes weren't because of U.S. military action. Instead, he said it was a direct result of Iran itself carrying out what he called deranged terror attacks on commercial oil tankers. This was sort of presented as more proof of the regime's instability.
But to reassure everyone, the president really hammered home the idea of U.S. energy dominance. He claimed that because of his administration's policies, America was now pumping out more oil and gas than Russia and Saudi Arabia combined. The message was clear. The U.S. could withstand any disruptions from the Middle East.
And here is where a really crucial strategic shift was mentioned. He pointed to a recent military action in Venezuela, which he called masterful, and said the U.S. was now partnering with them for oil. This, in his words, was making America totally independent of the Middle East.
But, a victory like the one he described, it wasn't without its cost. And the address then shifted to a much more somber tone to acknowledge the human toll of the operation.
13. That was the number. 13 American service members had lost their lives in the first month of Operation Epic Fury.
The president talked about visiting Dover Air Force Base to meet with the families of those who had fallen. And he shared this detail, saying that every single family member he spoke with urged him to see the mission through, to finish the job.
And to put the 32-day timeline into perspective, the speech directly compared its length to other major American wars. The point he was making was that this operation was specifically designed to be swift, to be decisive, and to avoid the kind of long, drawn-out wars the country had seen in the past.
All right, so that brings us to the final piece of the puzzle here, the outcome. Let's dig into how the address framed the results of the conflict and what the path forward was going to look like.
Now, this is a really interesting distinction that he made. The president was very clear. He said regime change was not our goal.
But he immediately followed that up by saying that since most of Iran's original leaders were now dead as a result of the military strikes, regime change had, well, effectively happened anyway.
So, the path forward from there was laid out as a very clear choice for Iran's new leadership, who he described as a more reasonable group. They had two options: either make a deal, or the U.S. would escalate and target the country's electrical grid. And he said a conclusion to all of this was expected very shortly.
And that was really the final takeaway. The overall message was that the mission had been a huge success. Its main goals were almost all achieved, and the end of major combat was right around the corner.
So this all leaves us with one final, pretty powerful question that comes right from the language of the speech itself. If a country is described as decimated and the military goals are nearing completion, what does the future actually look like for Iran and for the entire region?